Hello, friends, and welcome to the City of the Immaculata. It's good to be back with you. The City of the Immaculata is a place where we discuss history and theology. This is a new channel, and I'd ask you to help me out by hitting the like button. And if you find the content helpful, please consider subscribing and sharing it with others. Thank you. Today, we're looking at Eastern Catholics in America. Did the Latin Church discriminate against them? A common narrative that I've heard over the years per this story is that there was these evil Latin bishops in the US who were just malicious and cruel and hated Eastern Catholicism, and therefore a fearless saint rose up from among the ranks who pushed these Eastern Catholic groups into Eastern Orthodoxy, wherein he took tens of thousands with him. Now, as with many of these types of histories, the reality gets lost in a fog of complexities. But once you really dive in, you'll see that the truth may bear things different than what you've come to accept. The story of Catholicism in America is especially a tricky one. Its layers deep, and you can never really wrench any particular story out of the context of the whole within the context of the US. And what I attempt to do here is to give some justice to the whole rather than just looking at one specific element of the whole story. So in order to do that, we must back up a little bit. The story of America will always include lessons of this country's historical tragedies surrounding its treatment of racial minorities. But less well known, though in many ways not less potent, is its history of anti-Catholicism. Historian John Higham once said that anti-Catholicism was the most luxuriant, tenacious tradition of paranoiac agitation in American history. And just to give you some social background on this, just starting with how this sort of rose up from among the society itself, just a few examples here. And one very powerful one comes from Maria Monk, okay, and her awful disclosures of the Hotel Dieu nunnery in Montreal. This is something akin to a Jack Chick publication, if you're familiar with Chick, if he's even still relevant these days. He's just an inflammatory anti-Catholic that just comes up with the most salacious stories that his imagination and imagination of those around him can come up with. And this particular tale is within that line of thinking. It's a sordid tale about debauchery in a Canadian monastery that was designed to feed into and profit from an already existing anti-Catholic bias within the United States. You know, the public wanted to believe in a Vatican plot to destroy the world. It wanted to believe that there were these horrendous sexual crimes taking place among priests and religious, so on and so forth. And there were grifters that were ready to sell that story to the already desiring public. All of this fed into a cultural climate that was bound to lead to violence. And this culminated eventually in a series of riots wherein Catholic minorities in major New England cities were the targets of mob violence. Most infamously in a series of riots in 1844 in Philadelphia, in which several churches and numerous buildings were burnt and leveled, and people, including the nuns of the Sisters of Charities, were attacked. And the military had to be brought in to stop the nativist extremists from further violence and damage. And as is usually the case, the social landscape eventually affects the political. And in time, a political party was formed, the Know Nothing Party of 1855. And though it was short lived, it is the only U.S. party ever formed around the elimination of a religious minority. Its official name was the Party of the Native Americans. The events surrounding their election and regional governments was often marred by violence, including 1855 riots in Louisville, Kentucky, the race for the office of governor. 22 were killed and many more were injured. In Baltimore, the mayoral elections of 1856, 1857, and 1858 were all marred by violence and well-founded accusations of ballot rigging. In Ellsworth, Maine, in 1854, the Know-Nothings were associated with tarring and feathering of a Catholic Jesuit priest, Johannes Baptist, and they also burned down a Catholic church in Bath, Maine. Another example of how this took effect in the political landscape was the Blaine Amendment of 1875. This was the Grant administration's attempt to make federal law a New York state law that deemed that no state or federal money could be raised to support private, read that as Catholic, schools. At the time, due to the violence, the increasing pressure from Protestant teachers and leaders, Catholics banded together to get these parochial schools opened to protect their children from what they saw as the American corrupting influences, and rightly so. I mean, you can see here under the Blaine Amendment, one of the political cartoon captions was, it was sold to the public as Protestants protecting Protestant children from these popish bishop crocodiles that are coming from Rome to feed on the souls of the young. Now, often in places like New York, where the voting blocks was large enough, the Catholics there would seek money from the state to help subsidize the opening and operations of the schools, which is what the Blaine Amendment itself was seeking to eliminate. So you can imagine it's a precarious situation for the bishops in the United States. They're getting pressures from both the political and the societal spheres. Just for example, right, a constant pressure of proselytization, where Catholics are seen as fair game. Protestants were constantly trying to convert Catholics. They were trying to eliminate Catholic schools and bring Catholic children into the Protestant fold. There were pressures for funding, and the funding was always a balance between helping to promote the faith, but also funding operations as well. So Catholic bishops, in so much as the government was willing to give them money, there was often strings attached to the money. There was always the threat of persecution at play, as we can see with some of these riots that took place. There was the problem of a general malaise, right? The secularization is a powerful force. We talk about that on this channel quite often. And in the United States, you would get Catholics that would come over here that would focus mainly on work and trying to better themselves economically, and they would just let their religious inclinations and sensibilities sort of fall by the wayside. And there's always the pressure and the argument around, what does assimilation look like? And we're going to delve into that a little bit deeper, because that's sort of the problem of what we lead to later. And as we'll come to see, there's really no clear plan of action. The bishops, they often disagreed with each other on how to manage and how to navigate these situations. And into this confusion steps another problem that actually comes from outside the U.S. The issue of the Americanism heresy. Now, this is a little bit of a complex one, and it probably deserves its own series of lectures, and there might even actually be some good ones that you could find online. But it's a title that's given to it by European opponents, and it doesn't exactly mean what you may think it means. Americanism is something that brings to mind, say, a certain degree of, like, say, secularism or Protestantization, and that's not necessarily what this is getting at. What this was there was, particularly in France, there was a group of more traditionalist, even though at that time that would have meant something different, traditionalist-leaning priests and bishops who saw a sort of trend. It wasn't necessarily a unified systematic heresy. It was more of a trend, though it was presented to Rome as something maybe a little bit more unified than what it was. Some of the key features of this heresy, as it's presented to Rome and as Rome presents it back to the United States as a problem, are the interior spiritual initiatives and emphasis on natural virtues over theological virtues, certain attacks on religious vows and orders, hiding of religious convictions publicly, minimizing the importance of spiritual direction, and a belief that all opinions can be aired publicly equally. So when Rome, the key propositions are condemned by Pope Leo XIII in his Testum Benevolentatiae Nostrae. When Leo presents this, the U.S. bishops are sort of puzzled. They're not quite for sure where this is coming from. Bishop Cardinal Gibbons, in particular, responds that no such thing exists in the United States, and Leo sort of steps back and says, "Okay, no, we're just saying, there's some word coming out that this is taking place, and we just want to make sure that it's actually not taking place." So there's pressure coming from Rome about something that's not quite clear. And one of the things, and this is part of the complexity of this story, is that some of these, if some of these key features are the beginnings, the creeping in of what would later in the 20th century be condemned as modernism, which there was actually such a thing taking place in the U.S. It's just that it wasn't such a concerted effort that the bishops would necessarily in the U.S. be able to spot it and point it out. Now, the bishop's overarching concern, and this is sort of the concern of where the American heresy was coming from, where the traditionalists in France were sort of attacking, was how to and how much to assimilate Catholics into American society. And just as a little aside note, this wasn't so clear cut that it was sort of an open and shut case that it was resolved right away, because you have the issue leading all the way up into World War II, wherein the tradition in the U.S. became to include the United States flag within parishes, because it's a kind of a unique thing that began in the American church, which is, and this gets back to this sort of problem of assimilation. Is Catholics have always struggled in the U.S. to find their identity both as Catholics and as United States citizens, because oftentimes they are at odds with one another, and I would say that's an objective reality. Though Catholic tendency, and we'll get into this really here in this next slide, Catholic tendency is to sort of assimilate to the point where certain lines begin to blur. In the U.S., the bishops were clear that this is okay, right? Like you can because the effort of bringing the flag into the parish was actually to commemorate fallen Catholic soldiers in the World War II conflict. So there was good intention there, but it's always this push pull, this back and forth between Catholic and American identity with American Catholics. And there's no better example of this than the case of Bishop John Ireland, a key player in this story. So 1838 to 1918, Bishop St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, he's a Republican, interestingly enough, in a time when most Catholics and most bishops would have been Democrats. Now, he promoted racial equality when it was still considered sort of an extremist position to promote such ideals, right? If you can imagine. Now, he also helped, there were Irish immigrants who were settling in the U.S. And, I talk about this in my other video about the early Catholic communities. And as they're settling in the U.S., they're settling into slums. And he had a great concern for those communities, and he helps them settle out of these slums in the major cities and move them into the West. So he's part of this colonization process, which is we're going to leave aside the issues with colonization. I'm going to bring that up actually in later talks. But for now, his intentions here are to help the Irish immigrants get out of this sort of often horrendous situation that they're placed in. And he's also, as well, as these Irish immigrants are coming into the West, one of the problems that they had is often young girls, Irish girls are tricked into prostitution. And so he helps to establish a society that's dedicated to protecting these Irish girls, both from getting tricked into the prostitution rings, but also getting them out of it once they're in it. So those are two key features of him. He's also very involved in the civic world of the U.S. He's friends with both President McKinley and President Roosevelt. And a key feature to his bishopric is that he wants to modernize and assimilate Catholics into the greater American society. That is via American values, American political leanings. And by political meanings, I mean that sort of liberal, classical sense of liberalism, and also he is also he wants to assimilate American Catholicism into America's greater religious sensibilities, that is, its Protestant sensibilities. And oftentimes he's at odds with other bishops and with Rome, especially, and he's especially defiant towards the papacy. When some of these issues are getting decreed from Rome during his lifetime and during his bishopric, he is he's often a guy that's uh, the one that Rome is pointing to when they're saying there's a problem with some of your prelates and some of your bishops. They're, it's all but naming people like Ireland. So I just want to point out here, I try to be as objective and fair as I can in all of these things. This is a complex man. He's not totally without his redeeming qualities, okay? I mean, you can see here, right? I mean, he's promoting racial equality, which is a good thing. He's helping Irish immigrants get out of the slums. He's helping to protect young girls from prostitution. All of these things are things that we can, laud him for as admirable qualities. But he's also a proponent of Americanism in the heretical sense that Rome means it, but also in the secular sense of Americanizing the Catholic Church. And some of the later problems that we would have in the American Catholic Church after the reception of Vatican II and the liturgical forms in the U.S. and some of the insanity that ensues from that. If you're wondering where some of that comes from, there's a long history of it that sort of goes back to people like John Ireland, who wants to see the American Catholicism basically absorbed into the American ethos, really to the point of oblivion. And to give you just an example, kind of what this looked like, I just want to point out one here, and it's the issue of the parochial schools. So you have a Bishop McQuaid in Rochester, New York, and he saw the public school system as dominated by Protestantism, rightly so, which it was, and he sees it as a danger for Catholics and Catholic children in particular, who would be under the sway of these Protestant teachers. So McQuaid is on this mission to get as many Catholic schools started. He wants a Catholic school in every parish, tied to every parish in his diocese, and he wants to see that across the board in the U.S. And this is his way of sort of halting the tide of the Protestantization of Catholics that he sees taking place, right? He wants to draw that clear line in the sand, which I think he could be commended for in that respect, right? Trying to protect the identity of Catholics and by opening up these Catholic schools, which goes back to he oftentimes was seeking funding from the state of New York. And Bishop Ireland, on the other hand, promoted and wanted children to enter public schools, and he lamented even the need for parochial schools within the U.S. society. So Ireland, as I mentioned, he's a Republican. He backs the Republican Party in New York State, and he backs the Blaine Amendment in the state, which which, even though it doesn't become federal law in 1875, it does become law in New York State against to the never-ending consternation of Bishop McQuaid, due to the help and the funding, due to the help and the backing of this Bishop Ireland meddling in the affairs of New York State. Bishop Ireland being, Bishop of Minnesota. The Blaine Amendment gets passed in New York State, and the Catholic schools are defunded. And Ireland backs the Poughkeepsie Plan, which sold his diocesan schools to the state. So this particular plan wanted to in his own state. He sees the Poughkeepsie Plan, which is tied to the Blaine Amendment, as a way in of moving forward in his own diocesan schools. So he sells his diocesan schools to the state, wherein they were all forbade to teach religious education, which is the problem once you made this sort of deal with the devil that Ireland made. Ireland was also an advocate of the English-only policy among immigrants, which was, he was dealing with a lot of German immigrants in his community, and later he was dealing with a lot of these Slavic immigrants. And his policy was English only because he's part of that assimilation, right? That assimilation process where we literally just get sucked up into the American ethos. Okay, so now, Eastern European immigrants. So into this complex situation comes the Eastern Catholics. And these are people that are primarily from the Austro-Hungarian Empire of the time, right? It's gone away today, but it's a Slavic peoples of present-day states of Hungary and Poland and Slovakia and Romania and the Ukraine, and they heavily pour into these coal mining towns. They would in time as they're coming in for work, and they're working down in the mines and they're starting these communities. It's an interesting thing that when you go to like Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Ohio, you find these clusters of Eastern Catholic parishes. Well, the reason for that was because that's where they were coming to, so for work. And as they're coming there for work, they are riding back home in time, inviting the priest to come with them as well. So one particular group of these group of ethnics, the Ruthenians in St. Paul, Minnesota, invited a particular man, Father Alexis Toth, 1853, 1909. So he was ordained a priest in the Ruthenian Greek Catholic Church, 1878. He was a widower. In 1889, he answers the request from this community to come to the U.S. to minister to the migrant population in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it was the custom of the time for Eastern priests to visit the reigning Latin bishop, right? There's no real bishops for them to answer to in the U.S., so they just as a customary thing would come to the Latin bishop to introduce themselves. And who was the Bishop of St. Paul, Minnesota? Well, none other than our friend, Bishop Ireland. And herein lies the conflict. Now, I'm going to quote at length here from Toth's own memoirs. I haven't been able to find in any of the archives Ireland's take on this story. I don't even know if Ireland necessarily saw this as a significant enough event in his life to make note of it. I don't think he kind of realized the damage he was about to inflict. But we're going to stick with Toth's story, though I always say with history, the old saying, there's two sides to every story. So, let's give Toth his due here. I don't think he probably wasn't dishonest, but there's probably Bishop Ireland had his story as well, and we can infer from some of what happened and some of what we know about Bishop Ireland what becomes of this. So this is from Toth's memoirs. This is how he says the exchange went when he introduces himself to Bishop Ireland. Bishop Ireland asks, "Have you a wife?" Toth replies, "No." "But you had one." "Yes, I am a widower," Toth said. At this, the bishop threw his paper on the table and loudly exclaimed, "I have already written to Rome protesting against this kind of priest being sent to me." Toth said, "I am a Catholic priest of the Greek Rite. I am a uniate. I was ordained by a lawful Catholic bishop. I do not consider either you or this bishop of yours Catholic. Besides, I do not need any uniate priests here. A Polish priest in Minneapolis is sufficient. The Greek Catholics can have him for their priest." Toth replies, "But he belongs to the Latin Rite. Our people do not understand him. They will hardly go to him. That is why they built a church of their own." Bishop Ireland says, "I gave them no permission to build, and I shall grant you no permission to work there." Now, keep in mind in the context to what kind of man we're talking about here with Ireland. As I'll show later, a difficult reality that we as Catholics must accept, Latin Catholics in particular here, about our own past is that our bishops and our missionaries, in the Native American affairs in particular, as it's another story I'm going to get to at another time, took a policy of strict assimilation. Now, you do have men like McQuaid who are trying to sort of halt the advance against Protestantism, but what he was mainly particularly concerned about saving was the Latin Catholic identity. He wasn't necessarily concerned about saving the Eastern Catholic identity. And, at times, just as much as we, the Latins, want to protect our unique identity, these Eastern Catholics wanted to protect their own unique identity. And I just want to bring out just a few of what the problems here are. And one of the major problems here is the problem of jurisdiction. So, as it was with the early Latin Catholic immigrants, Easterners immigrating to the U.S. was not a concerted, planned action, right? Work shows up, there's a need for people immigrate in mass, and this kind of comes in waves, waxes and wanes, more times than oft, more at some times, less at others. So once they're here, though, they begin requesting for priests of their particular rights. And these priests were acting under the jurisprudence of their homeland bishops, one parish being independent from another, right? So, parish in St. Paul, Minnesota would be different than the parish in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, or wherever they may be. Philadelphia wouldn't have been a big one, but Pittsburgh for sure. Some of those rural areas around like West Virginia and rural Pennsylvania, all of these different parishes independent from one another, requesting um, priests from their particular rights. And the Latin bishops were already established in the US were often unaware or at the very least misinformed about what was taking place within these communities. And they were misinformed or unaware about what the law was with respect to overlapping jurisdictions. So you can see it's a little bit of a fuzzy area here as all this is taking place, because it's not like, you as a Slavic ethnic group in St. Paul, Minnesota would request to Rome, and then for Rome to go request a priest. You would write directly to the area that you were familiar with and that you came from and request a priest from them. And it's not like they would go through Rome before sending a priest. They would say, okay, this area needs a priest, we're going to send a priest. And you can see as a custom, these priests would go to the Latin bishops out of respect. And in turn, the Latin bishops weren't necessarily respectful back towards them. So this is an atmosphere of of resentment and misunderstanding, and mixed into this was the already confused stance and disputes of the church in America with respect to American ideals, right? So you have Latins arguing amongst themselves about how exactly to assimilate into the U.S., and just added into this problem is the unfortunate example of what happens with these Eastern Catholics. Another problem is just general confusion from Rome, right? I mean, Rome is usually slow to act in things, and at times that's good. At times it can be a problem that sort of leads to further problems down the road. It's not until 1907, Pope St. Pius X, in Ie Semper sort of begins to attempt to quell the conflict. He appoints a Ukrainian bishop, who's was the intent is to be the bishop for all the Slavic Eastern Catholics in the Byzantine Rite in the U.S. But later there's a dispute because the ethnic communities there were often at rival with one another. So there's dispute among them, and that splits into a separate eparchy. And the jurisdiction of these is actually not very acceptable in this 1907 decree, because it places them as auxiliary bishops under the Latin bishops, which is not a good place for them to be. And it also doesn't allow for married priests to be sent. And in 1929 is a major problem. In 1929, there was an official suppression of married priests among the Eastern Catholics, which led to sort of another exodus in mass of certain Eastern Catholics into the Eastern Orthodox Church of America. The issue is really not fully resolved until the Second Vatican Council's Orientalium Ecclesiarum, which sort of establishes that the rights of the Eastern Catholic churches are their own independent, have their own independent jurisdictions, right? And that was one of the big problems, right? Because when you place them as auxiliary bishops under the Latin bishops, I mean, I understand the thinking there from Rome was that you don't want confused jurisdictions. And what they didn't really foresee with all of this, which was really resolved with this decree from the Second Vatican Council, was that it's actually not overlapping jurisdiction; it's jurisdiction of separate rights of independent churches. So it's not like they're not, you don't have Bishop X in Minnesota stealing from the Latin bishop in Minnesota, right? It's a separate jurisdiction with its own ecclesial rights, rights. And so the Orthodox Church of America, when you go to their sources, they claimed they claimed thousands of conversions from this whole process alone. It probably was. I mean, in some ironic sense, it's sort of the beginnings of the formation of the Orthodox Church of America. But the other thing that I want to make clear with all of this, and it's probably the most besides the arrogance of the Latin bishops, it's probably the second most thing that fueled this movement of Eastern Catholics into this forming this Eastern Orthodox Church of America is this little known concept of pan-Slavic nationalism. So what is that? So pan-Slavic nationalism is a 19th and 20th century phenomenon, and it's born out of this nationalist identity after the Napoleonic Wars that you see take place all over Europe, right? Really all over the world, but here we're looking at Europe, right? So you have this sort of pan-Latinism of the Romance languages of Italian and Spanish and French with their certain identities, and then you have the Germanic pan-Germanism. But you also have, which is not as well known, is a pan-Slavism, and it's this ethno-national identity of these Eastern European Slavs. So that includes the Slavs of the East, right? So that's the people of the Rus, Russia, Belarus. That's the people of the Western Slavism. These would be the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovakians, and the Southern Slav Southern Slav national identities of the people of the Balkans, so Serbian, Bosnian, and these. And one of the key I mean, if you know anything about 20th century, right, many of the wars that were fought, World War I, World War II, were around this sort of growing concept of pan identity. And these people, they viewed themselves as having, the Slavic people in particular, viewed themselves as having been under the yoke of foreign powers for centuries, be that Byzantine power, be that Ottoman power, be that Austro-Hungarian power, and later even the Bolshevik powers, right, with the rise of the Soviet Union in the 20th century. So for many of these groups, their religious identity is deeply tied to their national identity. And the loss of your religious identity was also the loss of your national identity. So you take these people and you transplant them from their native countries into the United States. And in the United States, you have this whirlwind of the Latin church sort of struggling with its own identity. And you want to be, what's taking place back in your home country is this strong ethnic identity. And you have this Latin church saying, no, you've got to assimilate into our church, which is in some quasi way, are we going to assimilate into the Protestant church? And I mean, it was the Eastern Catholic communities wanted to take their stand against that. Now, in many ways, you had the process of this thing called Latinization, where some of these Eastern Catholics took upon themselves Latin identities, or even some of those Latin identities were sort of foisted upon them, willingly or unwillingly at times. For example, the condemnation of, or at least the banning of, bringing in married priests. This was a certain Latinization that took place at least until the Second Vatican Council. But, I just want to add to this. When I hear this story often told, this particular part of the story is not included in it. And we all know, and I know it's sort of the bane of Christianity from the beginning, is ethnic, national identities and our roles as Christians, as brothers and sisters to one another, has always been a problem with the church. For better or for worse, there's times when the church and the state worked in closer harmony with one another. There's times where they've been in conflict with one another, and even when they were in harmony, let's say, a king, you lived under an emperor or a king that was kind towards the Christian community that he was ruling over. He wasn't necessarily kind to the Christian community next door, and or he wasn't necessarily kind to the Christian minority within his community, right? So this whole, and it's a big problem in the Eastern Church, and many Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholics acknowledge that nationalism and ethnic identities is sort of a problem, but it's been a problem in the Latin Church as well, and I don't want to undermine that. And it's been a problem with the American Catholic Church as well, as we in our own world attempt to figure out our identity as Catholics and as Americans. So, going back to the whole purpose of all of this, right? Did the Latin Church, the bishops, did they discriminate against Eastern Catholics in the United States? In a word, my humble opinion is yes. And I'm not saying that to be inflammatory. I'm not saying that to cause scandal. I'm a person that believes that the church, we Latin Catholics, have to come to a reckoning with our past in certain ways. And as much as we want to hold on to and hold up the glorious things of our past, which there are many glorious things in our past, there are some hidden things in the dark corners of our closet that certain Catholics want to shy away from, they want to keep dark. And my personal opinion is that that doesn't help us out. And those things need to be brought to light. And part of what I do on this channel is bring some of these lesser known things to light while giving, the full story, both sides, their context. And that's what I want to do here. But, when it comes to healing, part of the process of healing has to be that the abuser acknowledges the mistakes that they made. And in this case, all things considered, the Latin Church made some errors. And we can look at that, right? So to look at that in full here, in full context, as best I can, right? The Latin bishops, granted they were in a hostile country dealing with a hostile people. They're trying to shepherd souls who are distrustful of them, right? And who threaten the precarious threads that they're trying to hold together. That's what they are up against when they're like sort of looking. You can imagine Bishop Ireland and this young priest, Father Toth, coming to him, and he's got this big stack of papers, and he's dealing with all of these things with, he's trying to argue with McQuaid in New York, and he's got these big grand problems, right? And here's this little ethnic community. They already don't trust him, and they're a threat to this sort of assimilation process that he's working on. So while that may explain the actions, it doesn't excuse them. And that's ultimately what this comes down to. So while acknowledging the complexity of the situation and the hard decisions that they were faced with, in opposition to each other, in opposition to the United States, the American society, and the American government in general, while I'm acknowledging all of that, the Latin bishops should have been more pastoral to the needs of their flock. And that's ultimately what this comes down to. Now, would I want to have been in their situation? No. I mean, they're hard decisions to make, and I can grant a little bit of leeway to them, but ultimately, in hindsight, looking back, they were not meeting the needs of their flock in this case. So regardless of their suspicions against the Latins and Westerners in general, the lay and the priests of the Eastern Catholic communities made attempts to stay within the fold. and many did stay within the fold. It's not like we lost all of them, but we lost a lot, right? So the ones that stayed in the fold oftentimes stayed in the fold against the discrimination, despite the discriminations that were taking place, right? And to be clear, this is not like a uniform thing, right? It's not like all the bishops were bad. Some did make attempts as best as they could. If you're familiar, there was this thing called biritual faculties, where a Latin priest would take on the faculties of a rite within their community. And the idea was to, okay, this community needs they need a priest. The priests aren't necessarily coming. There's all these problems. We will train this Latin priest in the faculties of the particular rite of the community, and he'll be able to perform their rites. Now, this comes with its own problems, and it wasn't really a solution. It wasn't necessarily a good solution, but I'm acknowledging that it was an attempt to tend to the flock without overthrowing the flock, if you will. But it does appear, taking into account the pan-Slavism, which I don't think is necessarily always taken into account as full as it should be, taking that into account and taking into account all the complexities of the modern national isms, right? The Slavism and the Americanism and all of these things, right? We did lose many to the haphazard and callous handling of the situation by the Latin Catholics, the bishops in particular. So, it's a tragic situation, and this is my attempt to do justice to the story. And, if you guys have any thoughts on any of this, if you have anything to add to it, please leave some comments. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and I appreciate you tuning in. Thank you.